Hi, everyone. I'm Gail Renard. I'm the treasurer of the WGGB, and I'm thrilled that we're having this event today. It's a day that we're celebrating poets and poetry, which the Guild hasn't done for a very long time, too long. But I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel. Wave when I call your name. We have Kate Fox. Hi there, Kate. We also have Michael Rosen. Thank you. We have Testament Homecut. Testament, there you are. And we have Andy Croft, who's poet and also the publisher of Smokestack Books, which is a poetry imprint. So, like I said, I'm Gail, and I'm the one in Kermit Green. So let's start. Testament, do you mind if I kick off with you? Which I'm going to ask everyone, and then we'll sort of get into it. When did you first know when you were a poet, and what are you proudest of in your poetry?
I straddle a lot of disciplines. So poetry is one of the things that I do, but it seems to be at the heart of all the different mediums and types of writing that I operate in. It sort of starts from poetry, really. Um, when did I know? I don't know. Like my first sort of, I spent about 10 years as a rapper, um, which is a form of which is poetry. So I guess I knew I was a rapper um, from whatever 15, 16. I knew that's what one of the things I really wanted to focus on, and um, I knew that that was poetry. But when I started to get involved in getting to invited to poetry nights and to perform in more traditional poetry settings, or people asked to put my word in print, etc., that wasn't till I don't know, 21 or 22. And even then, like the sort of the fear of being found out sort of lingered for at least another 15, 20 years.
And which are you proudest of from what you've written?
Um, I wrote a poem. I wrote a poem about poetic devices, and I use a metaphor to describe a metaphor, a simile to describe a simile, juxtaposition to describe juxtaposition, etc., which gets used in lots of schools all over the world. And yeah, it's just really great to have a real like to a demythologizing and giving a toolkit to young people to play with things. I think that's great.
Can I say I love that poem? It is fantastic. So thanks. Uh, but Michael, Michael, would you like to tell
Yeah.
us about when you first knew you were a poet?
Um, I first started writing poems when I was about 15 or 16, but I don't think I sort of thought I was a poet until maybe the first book of poems came out, which wasn't until 1974. Let's have a think. No, I was then 28. So I think, have I got that right? Yeah. So I think I was somebody who writes poems and then poet when a book came out. I think that's how it worked for me. Poem I'm most proud of. I'm not sure really. I think what makes me quite proud is the fact that if you stick me in front of an audience, I can nearly always find some poems that I can read. So if you put me in front of 2-year-olds, I can do 2-year-olds. And you put me in front of 102-year-olds, I can sort of manage something there. It's just very slowly evolved that way, and I guess that does make me quite proud. So, yeah, I think that's it. It's not any one individual poem.
Kate, can I ask you when you first knew you were a poet?
Um,
I think. Here you go.
yeah, I think one of the first poems that I performed, I was 8 and I was entertaining my family on a hot car journey, and it was about a fly. I'm a little fly, and here I go smack into the car window. But I am finding that how did you first know you were a poet really interesting, because we wouldn't say how did you first know you were a plumber, I suppose, would we? Or how did you first know you were an accountant? And I try to be really unsentimental about it, but actually I think I had my first poetry book when I was 28 and felt a fraud because it was funny and it was performance poems, and convinced myself I couldn't really be a poet until I had a serious poem published, which probably didn't happen until 2021. So it's not a simple question, that. When did you know you were a poet? Anyway, those are some answers. Thank you, Gail.
The first time I saw Kate Reid, which must be 20, 25 years ago, I said, I don't know if you remember this, Kate, afterwards, I came up to you and said, you're not just a comedian, you're a poet as well. Don't swallow your last line. Don't be apologetic about the poet inside your work. I'm not saying I discovered you, but at that time, you weren't sure what you were doing. You are now.
Yeah, I am now. Well, that's a lovely confirmation of that stickiness I had around it, actually. So thank you for being one of the people who convinced me eventually that I am.
What, did you have a favorite piece?
I feel proudest of when other people tell me that my poems, or me speaking my poems, or me performing or running a workshop has made them write something. Honestly, like I maybe one day I will write the thing that makes me go, above all that, my PhD, actually, which does have poetry in.
Andy Croft, what about you? When did you first start?
Well, when I was 11, me and my best mate, Pete, we wrote a solemn little poem about the war in Biafra. I cannot imagine why we thought we wanted to do this. It was an acrostic. It was terrible. And it spelt Biafra. B for Biafra, where there's bloodshed everywhere. I for the ignorance of people who don't care. So where we got this idea from, I have no idea. But the Biafran War was on our TVs in the mid-1960s every night. That was the first TV war for us, not the war in Vietnam. And Pete's dad, he copied it out and sent it to the local paper where it was published. So by the age of 11, I obviously had some sort of compulsion, but I don't know what that compulsion was or where it came from. And it still feels like a compulsion. I don't write because I want to. I don't write poems because I've got an idea. But there's things that still need to be said. And most of the poems in the world haven't been written yet. And most of those unwritten poems are better written by other people. But there are just a few that I think I can still probably write better than others. And my compulsion is to finish those poems, or in many cases to start them, while I'm still on the planet.
Do you have any favorite? Or?
No, the moment of pride is for all those years that I wanted to write poetry and didn't know how. I read poetry, I organized poetry readings, organized poetry festivals. I didn't know how to do it. And then at some point, I learned how to do it, or I taught myself, or other people taught me how to do it. So the moment of pride is every time I finish a line, which I think is finished, or every time I finish a verse or a poem, which I think is finished. Every time a book comes out, it's unbelievable, really, each time that I can still do it. Anyone remember the record Sparky and His Magic Piano?
Oh, yes.
That's an imposter syndrome story. I still expect the piano to stop working for me each time I'm writing a new poem. Why would I imagine that the magic is still going to be there? And the fact that, I'm not saying it's magic, my poetry, but the fact that I can still do it sometimes to the level that pleases me, then that's what I'm proud of. I'm allowed in. I'm allowed to play.
We've got a question from one of our members. What is the most effective way to create positive social change, or at least inspire people with poetry? Posting poems online or publishing the traditional way? Anyone want to pick that one up? Testament?
Yeah, I'm just giggling to myself. Like, it's a question that I think it's really, yeah, I'm someone who really also probably like the author of that question really is hungry to see things change and get better. And then the idea, I can remember just being a young man writing young man poems about how angry I am at the state of the world, and thinking that by writing a poem, I'm gonna all of a sudden, that's when the Prime Minister will resign when I finish this poem. Um, and but yeah, that sort of youthful thing. I don't know. I think in order to create change, you've got to reach lots of different people, and when I think about things that actually kind of got there, like the South Africa apartheid in South Africa, for example, I think, wow, okay, you had Denzel Washington and what's his face, Attenborough doing a film with a bad South African accent, fantastic. You had people doing songs, you had all these different like people saying we're not going to buy this product, and it takes a whole spectrum of things, different strokes for different folks, and what might reach me might not reach my mum, which might reach my. So I think if we're all putting our stories out there, I don't know if there's a one size fit all. Projecting something on the side of Parliament might really inspire some people and really turn other bunch of people off. So it might, I don't know. I think that's why the plurality of different stories and voices is so important. Who are you building next to? I always think, who are you building next to? I always think.
Oh, that is quite something. But Kate, I see you nodding. Do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I am also typing and answering chat because I'm aware if my internet connection is dodgy, that's not useful. Agreeing with Testament about many voices in many forms. Poets are only going to make incremental shifts, but we can make even a little, we're like butterflies nudging hurricanes. That's one thing. So everything is useful. I spy an opportunity though. Now, protest, peaceful, non-violent protest is becoming increasingly proscribed, terrifyingly so. Poetry is one of those spaces where I could, for example, write a poem about my love for the Marks and Spencer's strawberry cream sandwich, which is actually a disguised support for Palestine action, which obviously I wouldn't do because that's illegal.
No, you're right, because the great thing is we all have to protest in our ways, and it's finding the ways we can protest. But and well, also because I think what the member was saying, if I can look at the question, is about posting poetry online, poems online, or publishing the traditional way. I mean, Michael, would you agree it's all of the above?
Yes, I mean, it raises the question of what words can do anyway, doesn't it, in general, which we kind of wonder about. We're never quite sure whether words affect people or whether it's the person reading who does the affecting. So it's quite an intriguing and almost impossible thing to disentangle. But obviously we put this stuff out and we hope, at least I always hope, that poems are great things to start conversations. And if you write things that are kind of provocative or help people view the world in a certain way or illuminate in certain things, I always hope that it will start some kind of conversation. And then, there are movements out there that we choose or not to identify with. So, if you speak at if you read a poem at a demonstration, then you enter that rhetoric of that demonstration and what it's saying and what it's doing. If you have a poetry reading that night and some people are reading funny stuff and you stand up and read some political stuff, then you enter that particular moment. So I'm never quite sure whether a book does that. I'm always very aware that it's the face-to-face stuff that has the most effect. That's what I always tend to feel, but I've got no evidence for that.
Thank you, Michael, because, I mean, part of the thing is, well, which Andy might be able to talk about, Smokestack, because it's the viability of small poetry presses and publishers. How viable is printed poetry now?
Okay, before I say anything about that, can I just come in on that last question? Because that last question that last question about what can writers, what can poets possibly do in the face of Kate's hurricane, it is the question. It is the question that every writer, every time they pick up their pencil or turn on their laptop, has to ask themselves at the moment. How do we ridicule the patently ridiculous? How do we monster the monsters? How do we speak truth to power when those in power are not remotely interested in listening? How can we use language to talk about the debasement of public language? How can we speak truth when so much of public discourse is blatantly dishonest? So what can poets do? And by way of a small advert, I've just edited a little book here called Release the Sausages. It's a book of poems for Sir Keir Starmer. Michael's in it, or rather Michael's not in it, because it's a book of empty pages. There are no poems in it. It's 30. We've got lots of famous poets who've put their names on the back who are not in it, who have promised never, ever, ever to write a poem about Sir Keir Starmer, KC. No one's trying to engage with Keir Starmer through a poem because, personally, I don't think you can. What's better to belong to, Palestine action or Palestine inaction? When you are deaf, deaf, deaf to the IDF, how can you speak to them? That was a joke. Okay, so you were asking about the ecology of the small press world. We need probably longer than we've got to do that now. I'd say that the poetry world is so atomized, so divided against itself. What this group of poets like and do, what she thinks is poetry, what I think of as poetry, what those people do when they read together or when they go to libraries together or in this book group, what this publishing list does, what these prize-winning judges do, it's so completely different. It's not really possible to talk about the poetry scene in Britain anymore. It is so atomized. There are so many different ecologies, all completely ignoring each other and all kind of grumpily antagonistic towards each other. And the small press world is probably the more grumpily antagonistic than any other part, because it's run by people for whom poetry is necessary and important. People who don't make any money out of it. The poets don't make any money out of it. The publishers don't. The printers might, and the people who work in the bookshops. But it's, as so much of British life now, it's run by volunteers in their spare time for free, and that's where most people will be published. If they are lucky, there'll be tens of thousands of people today who are clutching a well-worn manuscript, which they are very, very proud of, which they've been working on for years, and which they need to know they're probably never, ever going to see in print unless they join the ecology of small regional presses around the country, which means they are going to be excluded absolutely from the world of prizes and awards and commissions, the whole showbiz thing which has colonized and taken over the poetry world at the top. It's a really grim place. It's not an industry. People talk about the poetry industry. It's just a really difficult place to live and work, mostly without any rewards of any sort. That doesn't mean that we don't have to do it, but it's just a bloody miserable place to be, which is why I wound Smokestack up after 20 years.
Michael, you're laughing. Do you want to jump in on this one?
Yes, I'd just say Andy is, as I know him, he is a miserabilist, but he's wonderful. And I'm very sorry that he has wound it up, because he was a fantastic host, publisher, editor, and all those things. But everybody has their limits, and I fully understand that and respect that. But ignore his miserabilism. That's all right. We have to have joy, we have to have hope, and actually secretly, if you're kind of in a car with Andy, he does express a bit of hope then. So he's a wonderful guy, so I'm saying all that as a compliment. Okay, see, look, he's shaking his head. He doesn't want to be called hopeful. So yes, in order to do this stuff, you have to have self-belief, and you do have to have hope. and you have to, you know, keep on and on and on. And I'm saying that as possibly the oldest person in the room. I don't know. And that's part of the fun of it, is that you know, you can go on writing virtually on your deathbed. In fact, I think some poets did. So it's something to look forward to.
Kate, you wanted to have a word about what poetry can do?
Yes, I will experiment with turning my video off, see if it helps. Yeah, well, I think because when you said, Gail, this is a celebration of poets and poetry, honestly, I did love the idea, but I knew what Andy Croft was probably going to say that wasn't going to sound like a celebration of poets and poetry. And B, because of that atomization, I like that this panel actually is asking about kind of radical poetry and radical poetry publishing. And I think the radical stuff is potentially in the hands more of audiences and participants than people who are, to be fair, like me, jobbing poets, actually. That's where radical possibilities lie, I think I would want to say.
Well, one of the questions that we got from Anthony, which was, what does radical mean to you? A testament? What do you reckon?
Well, radical comes, the etymology of radical is to do with root, right? The roots of things. So if we're gonna, it means digging up some stuff from the roots, or trying to, you know, rather than a quick pruning. Um, yeah, I didn't think I was going to do garden metaphors today. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I think so I think stuff that makes people question the roots, the system, and where we can go with it. And something that I really optimistically think is that when I look at you know, the history books and whatnot, you know, artists have often been the people to say, hey, what about that over there? What about this way of thinking about things? And it's a drop in the ocean, but you know, now we study them at GCSE, you know, so really rad, and then we sand off the edges like William Blake. We sand it off and sanitize it and put it in things. But you know what I mean? But actually, you got someone super radical there. But I think that's something that poetry can do. I think we are going through like a really weird literary thing, and I think there's about the root of how we get our words out into the world, and some ways are going to stay the same, and some really new forms are going to come through as well. You know, like from Ian McMillan's tweets, which he regularly tweets a line or two every day, and that, you know, it's worth. Or Lem Sissay when he was doing the sun salutation stuff. You know, I'd click in for that, even though, you know, before Elon Musk went bananas. Well, he's always bananas, but you know what I'm trying to say. Before it would turn to X, and I'd be like, oh, great. I get a little dose as I have my orange juice, and I'll start my day right. And that's one way of doing it, and then hopefully that means that the collection might get sold down the line. I'm not sure. I am I'm a bit of a chameleon, so my poetry hides in plays and in TV shows and in teaching in schools and stuff like that. So I haven't got I can't give you a collection. I can point to some stuff which has been put in anthologies, but I can't say, oh, boom, here's Testaments poetry. No one's paid me to write a poetry collection, but people have paid me to write plays, and so I'll shove it all in there then.
Kate is just saying in the chat box, radical for her is somehow mobilizing poetry's marginal position to disrupt binaries, hierarchies, and centers. Do you want to add to that, Kate?
Just to say that it does involve acknowledging the marginality of poetry. We are super marginal, but margins, edges can disrupt. And again, I feel optimistic at the moment about what poetry can do. We have more freedom than other forms. I can say more in a poem or on a poetry stage than a newspaper columnist can currently say, probably than an Instagram influencer in certain ways can say, than a news presenter can say. That's well, that's not happened for a while. That's good. Let's use it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Michael,
poetry,
Andy?
poetry at the moment is still relatively unpoliced, because the powerful and the mendacious don't know about poetry. They haven't got a poetry of their own. They don't care about poetry. So and poetry is primarily, it's an amateur, large scale mass participation sport, poetry. So there is a space here. I don't want to sound too hopeful or too joyful, as Michael would put it, but poetry at the moment does represent a potentially oppositional space for people to say things, as Kate says, that can't be said in other ways.
Michael, do you want to add to that?
Yeah.
And then
I mean, I'll start with two very grand abstract words, oppression and exploitation. And they don't mean a lot until you actually look at it from inside. So if you say, how am I oppressed, or how is that person over there oppressed? And it might be in tiny daily things, or it might be in something that's in your memory, or something that you discover. And then again, if you look at exploitation, again, it's a great big grand abstract word, but you only start having to unpick, for example, the latest thing with the disability benefit or anything like that, or you're looking at how profits are made and so on, but you're looking very directly at very concrete things that poetry can live off. I mean, poetry can be abstract as well, of course, but if you look at that, then if you're saying radical, then if you think that if you're running government or you're running business, what you always want is for people to not complain and not to rebel. So, what Chomsky called manufacturing consent, we can look at the world and look at where we're in, and every day consent is being manufactured. And as you say Ian Macmillan's little tweet poems, they're a view of the world from the bottom up, quite literally, sometimes looking at just what's sitting there on the pavement. And when you're manufacturing consent, you don't necessarily want people to be doing that, looking at the world from a subjective point of view and then sharing it. You only want, by and large, for the mass media point to be being made over and over again. And so poetry, almost of any kind, will tackle oppression and exploitation, either explicitly or implicitly. And I guess most of us here in this room are thinking about it being more explicit than implicit. But as I say, people are talking about William Blake. When he had Songs of Innocence and Experience, you read the Songs of Innocence and you think, well, there's nothing rebellious about that necessarily. And then you flip it all over, and the piece as a whole is one of the most revolutionary works that have ever been written, because it did look at the world and look at tiny little things. It seemed like Little Lamb, Who Made Thee? It sort of seemed like very, very innocent, and then suddenly you're in the middle of chartered streets and something called what did he call it? The marriage hearse, the wedding marriage hearse. Yes. So he was able to flick things over. So yes, poetry can do that. And I guess most of us in this room, that's the sort of poetry we're reaching for, that's making that, puncturing the manufactured consent and being in some level or another subversive in some way or another. Yeah.
Cheers, Michael. Testament, I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say something really glib. I might finish by saying something really glib, but no, I feel like something that poetry does really, really well. I saw Toby, the first time I saw Toby Campion perform, and he gave a poem about the whole his high school as a safari. That was the sort of like extended metaphor, and everybody, all the social groups were different animals, and he was a gay kid in a cis het school full of homophobia, and I can remember hearing him for the first time, and for a split second, I thought, oh, I might know what it's like to put his shoes on for a split second, in a way that I hadn't understood from watching other things or talking to other people. I was like, oh, it's like, empathy machines, right? And the poems can do that. They can take you to another planet. They can, whatever, drop you into someone else. So I think that's wonderful. And then glib thing I was going to say was that there is danger the way we're speaking is that poetry could be the new rock and roll.
Well, funny you should say that, because somebody Mark just put in the chat box, do you feel perhaps poetry has more or less migrated into hip hop? And so poetry is almost akin now to comparing a classic viola to a present day electric guitar. I sometimes feel that today, unless there's a beat or a tune playing behind the spoken poetic word, people don't stop to turn their heads to it as much, not unless the material is jarring.
Shall I jump in really quickly?
Yeah, please.
Literally, you could cut me and I'll probably bleed a bit of rap or something. I think it's just another form. You know, you could say that about the blues. You could say that about the Beatles. You could say, you know, it's another form. And there's loads of crap rap, and there's a lot of bad poetry as well, to be fair. And so it's just another form, like, you know. So I feel like I'm love that Kay Tempest is rocking Glastonbury and talking about the stories of using spoken word to talk about, and Kay's actually going into more conventional forms of rap again, like they used to, as well as breaking into spoken word. Very exciting. So I think, yeah, hip hop's still a little baby art form, and I got to meet Melly Mel 2 weeks ago, who wrote It's Like a Jungle Sometimes It Makes Me Wonder How I Keep From Growing Under, which is credited as being the sort of first rap social commentary. And yeah, that's actually really good writing. Whereas, you know, wave your hands in the air like you don't care, maybe less so sometimes. But yeah, I think it's just another form.
Cheers. I was going to say we've had two questions from younger people, and they're similar. I'll read them both because they probably go hand in hand. What's the best way to keep encouraging a young poet? My young hope has a lot of hope for change and writes to that. And I would say what goes with that was the other question we had from Kate. From my daughter, what's the best way for young poets to get their work out there? And is there any support for young neurodivergent poets wanting to get published? Who would like to take that one? Michael?
Yeah, I'll just say a thing. One of the advantages of the internet is that you can publish poems straight away. So you can blog, and I'm no great techno whiz, but I set up my blog in about 2 minutes. And I sometimes put poems on there. You've got Facebook, which has got, you know, you can make things as long or as short as you want. Obviously with X and some of the others, you've got word limits. But one of the first things I'd say to anybody writing poems is just to put them up, get them out there. And, you know, in my day, when I was a kid, you didn't have that. If you wanted someone to see your poems, you either had to hand them your handwritten poem or typewritten poem, or you got on a Gestetner machine and, you know, and tried to wind off 20 or 30 copies on a Gestetner machine, which I tell you was quite messy. So in a way, there's never been a better time to display and share your poems. Then you say to people, come and have a look, and you try and establish some kind of relationship. And then the same is going for the poetry slams and the poetry clubs, where, you know, they are around in pretty well most cities and most suburbs as well even. So I'd say always to people when they ask me is get it out there if that's what you want to do. I mean, obviously you can write poems and keep them quite secret. My mum did that. I don't think she ever shared any of her poems. But so I would always say is just start a blog and then go on Facebook or any other social media form that allows you the long form and not just 100 and whatever it is characters, and put your poems on there and try and establish an audience for them.
Another question that a lot of people have been asking, the usual writer's question is, how does one make a living as a poet? And I would say, does one? But would anyone like to speak to that, Kate?
Well, we have got several poets who make a living as a poet on the panel. So it is an interesting question to persist in asking, but people do. You diversify and do multiple things and run workshops and do different gigs, One does, but the idea that one doesn't is very, very problematic for one who wishes to. And it's really problematic for anyone who is a working class poet or a regional poet. Very problematic, which is why I'm so happy when recently there was a poet from Birmingham and one from my home city of Bradford. They had travelled down to London to take part in a thing called the Roundhouse Slam. They had done very well. One had placed first, one had placed third. And they had been able to kickstart something like poetry careers. Oh, no, I've done it too. I've put careers in quotes. I was flipping out. What am I doing? Anyway, that honestly made me feel optimistic. But I think one may then find oneself compromising elements of what you really want to do and getting stuck with loads of arts organisations and arts administrators who don't care about poets, poetry, radical thought, protest, culture, creativity.
Cheers. Michael, did you want to jump in or?
Yeah, I don't think there's probably only a tiny number of people who could say they made a living entirely and only through poetry. I mean, even someone like Benjamin Zephaniah, incredibly successful poet, or Pam Ayres, I don't know, maybe Pam did. But if you take, say, Benjamin, he did a lot of other things in the end. He was doing other things. I mean, it's pretty hard it would be to make a living just and only from poetry. That's not to say you can't earn some money, which, I mean, you can. You can earn some money if your book sells a lot, and you can earn some money from gigs, depending where you do them and how often. Whether you can get a mortgage or pay the rent, I wouldn't necessarily say. So you have to qualify it. That's all I'd say. Just as Kate has said. But I mean, when you're running a workshop as a poet, I mean, unless you're cynical, if you're cynical about it, then it won't work. But if you're not cynical, then in actual fact, running a workshop is part of your life as a poet. If you're cynical about it and just think, oh well, I'm just doing this because I need 500 quid or grand or whatever you can get, then it won't help you. It'll sort of eat away your soul. But if you put all your, as it were, your poetic spirit into the workshop, it will then help you because you will meet people. And just today I was working with children, what do we call them, looked after children, and we were improvising various things, me and the poet Zohab Khan, and one girl, she was only about 11, got up and freestyled. And it was just extraordinary. I mean, she was only 11, and it was just one of the sort of nicest, inspiring things that's happened to me for a long time. And it wasn't exactly a workshop, but it was sort of workshoppy. And it stops you being cynical when things like that happen. She stood up, Zohab did a beatbox, and she just freestyled over the top of it. And it was just quite extraordinary. I mean, just an 11-year-old. And I say just an 11-year-old. And she could just do it like that. And it was just so wonderful to see. Well, if you can enjoy that, then you don't have to think, it's taking you away from your poetry. It's all part of it. You're living in the poetic world.
There was an old poet called Jack Beeching who died a long time ago. He told me once, always keep your writing life and your money earning life as far from each other as possible, because otherwise one will contaminate the other. I think he was absolutely wrong. I'd completely support what Michael says, that it's not possible to make a career out of writing poetry, but it is possible to make a career out of, or make a living out of poetry. And it's all that teaching, all that workshopping, all that editing stuff. That's where poets learn. They learn from other poets, from small children poets, big children poets. Working with other people who are trying to write poetry is the best way of finding out how to write poetry. You can judge what works and what doesn't work, and why it doesn't work, and why this works. It's not a separate thing. But if you approach poetry thinking, how can I make a career out of it, then I think that's the wrong way round. Poetry is a space, and there's not much money in the space, and there's quite a lot of people competing for that not very much money. But if you understand that you're not going to make much money out of this, then that's okay, because then you can put aside thinking about the money thing and just concentrate on the poetry. But can I just come back on something Michael said about social media? When I support what you said, Michael, but I think that one of the problems with putting poetry on the internet is you are publishing to strangers. Not only is it not edited, it's not curated, but you don't know the people who are your first audience. And I think when you're starting out in poetry, you do need to know who you're writing for, who you're writing immediately for. Maybe it's for your mum or your girlfriend or your dad or your football team or your friends. Maybe it's for someone's birthday, but you do need to know. And just writing for strangers, which is what the internet requires you to do, is a really difficult thing, because you don't know who these strangers are. You don't know how to address them, to persuade them, to amuse them, to make them frown, to make them grin. It's a really difficult thing to write for complete strangers who you'll never ever see, and some of whom will be mad as well. We need to know that. So I'd say don't start by writing for strangers. Write for people who you know, because then you've already got some sort of basic understanding. They will understand where you're coming from, and you will understand what they're going to understand.
Testament, do you want to?
Yeah, so I definitely want to echo and totally agree. Like, a huge part of my practice is teaching everything from primary kids through to university to adults, and it sharpens your pen and gives you material and ideas and new ways of seeing things, and it's wonderful. Some people don't like teaching though, and some people might prefer in an academic context, in teaching a poetry course somewhere once you get your slippers on. But even then, the work's drying up there as well, which is hard. But Polar Bear, aka Steve Camden, who's one of my favorite humans and a great writer, he posted something years ago, and he said, "There's 8 billion people on this planet. You keep going, you'll be able to, if you might be able to find a way to find your audience in that 8 billion people." And I really hold on to that. And I think it is sometimes initially when you're putting stuff out, it's blundering in the dark. And hopefully you're writing stuff that you like. And maybe you've got someone in mind when you have written your poem, and the internet someone in that demographic will find it on the other end somehow. And then even like learning how to negotiate the different sectors of the internet, right? If I post it on this platform, I'm going to get this type of audience generally, or if I put this hashtag, or if I send the poems, if I do a poem about Egyptology and I send it to all the Egyptologists and all the Egyptology blogs, then it might get some traction. And they might think it's the worst thing ever. I recently did an eco poetry as part of Hot Poets with the mighty Kate Fox, one of the other poets involved. And I wrote a poem about hedges, and it gained real traction with people that were into sustainable farming, and it resonated. And there's it might not get to the person who the first audience I thought, but it might reach somebody else. So I think you're right, there is a blundering, Andy, I think. But it's also a learning process as well, is what I'm trying to say. But if you don't try, you're not going to know. And you might go, okay, that really didn't work. Next time I'm going to put it to music, and I'll do a Gil Scott-Heron and have someone playing drums in the background or something, might work next time.
Another question, because it's something that's I've come across before from AJ Dean. Does speculative, brackets, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, etc., poetry have a place and function in radical work in the same way genre fiction can? Take it away, Testament.
I don't know, but I think that's mega exciting. I mean, you've got verse novels now as well, and which are totally. I remember that, was it The Monkey's Mask, a really old one, which was amazing, like a whodunit. Dorothy, somebody I forget wrote it. It was incredible, like from the well, decades ago anyway. But now there's actually loads of verse novels, which is easier to make money off. But then writing a novel is a whole other headache, isn't it? But I'm excited. If someone said, "Oh, here's a collection of sci-fi, horror, genre poetry," it's all like twisted and dark, but it's going to make you rethink how the world works. I'm like, sign me up. So I don't know, just as a fan, like I want more stuff coming across that I can read.
Kate, what do you?
Yeah, I was recently at a conference on critical neurodiversity, which had a lot of literary studies people in. And it feels like there's a current coming from students, from academia, out of there, blending neuroqueer stuff and speculative fiction and poetry and horror. It's another thing I feel optimistic about. Not that I personally will massively want to read any of that, to be fair, but it did make me feel like, ooh, something exciting's happening here, some sort of melting pot thing where poetry will continue to be hybridized with many other things. And if it's coming from universities up, for better or for worse, I think there will be more of it.
Because I was also going to ask you, Andy, about Smokestack. What is the future of traditional publishers, poetry publishers?
Well, I'm bound to say bleak, but small presses aren't going to go away. The Arts Council have lost interest in small presses, and the regional arts associations never had much interest in small presses. So small presses are sustained by people doing it for nothing, as I said before, which means that government and the Arts Council, they can't take anything away because there's nothing for them to take away. So there is a freedom. Smokestack had a little bit of Arts Council funding for the first few years, but most of the time, well, that 20 years, I had no commissar squatting on my editorial life, telling me what I could and couldn't publish. And that's why the small press world is so much freer than the corporate publishing world. And that's why the corporate poetry publishing sector is so brain-numbingly boring, their output, because they are worried and they do have to think about sales. They do have to think about shareholders and dividends and bottom lines and all that kind of thing, all things which are completely inimical to poetry. So the small press world is the best place for poetry to breathe because there aren't those antagonistic forces poking sticks all the time, trying to spoil things. So it's not going to get easier, but it's not going to go away either. That's where poets should take their work, I think.
Michael, do I see your finger?
Yes, just another place is YouTube. My son created a channel for me, and I bung up poems and stories and things, mostly poems on there. I've largely subsidised it and do it myself, and we've ended up, I think this week we'll get to about 153 million views. Don't hardly make any dosh from it because it's in the children's sector, but the ads on it are nothing. But anyway, so it's, YouTube is another great place. Benjamin used YouTube a lot. Sorry, I keep mentioning Benjamin, but you can find his Wrong Radio and People Need People and things like that there. And it's wonderful. It's another way to distribute what you do. And of course, if you perform live to a live audience, or like I've read some of my poems on these recent demonstrations, well, they end up on YouTube as well. So it's another way, it's another area in which you distribute. Again, forget making a living out of it, but if you're interested in talking and finding out what these words mean and whether they reach people, then that's another sphere.
Well, time is flying. We only have a couple of minutes left. Unfortunately, I could speak to you all for longer than you'd like. But what I was going to say is also